this is George. He heard how exciting Hop Frog is, and he wanted to come finish the story with us today. So let's open up the story. We're going to continue with CER. I'm going to stop throughout only a couple times and really explain the story. A lot of students struggle with understanding it fully, so you are welcome to read it on your own. However, I would recommend reading it with me so that I can stop throughout and you can understand it better. So here is the reading. We left off, so when we left off yesterday, we learned that the king and his group of whatever, 7 homies, are having this big masquerade ball, which is a costume party. Now remember, this is back in the Middle Ages. We don't know an exact time frame. They didn't have phones or TVs or anything like that. So they're having this big ball and where everyone dresses up in costumes, not just fancy dress, but costumes. And the king and his 7 ministers love to play jokes on people. They're actually pretty mean about it. And the king has this jester whose name is Hop Frog. Now remember, Hop Frog is not a real frog. That's just his name in the story. That's his nickname because of the way he looks. So he is very disproportionate. He has a very small lower body and he limps when he walks, but he has very, very strong arms. George, I'll pet you later. So, Hop Frog has this best friend Tripetta, who is also a little person, who was also taken to be a gift for the king, and she's a beautiful dancer, and so they both are basically slaves of the king. So right now the king has asked Hop Frog and Tripetta to help them decorate for the ball and to help them figure out the costumes, because the ball is tonight, and they have no idea what they're gonna wear for their costumes. So that's where we pick up. We're halfway down the second page.
When the 2 little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council. But the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hop Frog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes and took pleasure in forcing Hop Frog to drink and, as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hop Frog," said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends." Here Hop Frog sighed. "And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters, man, something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink. The wine will brighten your wits." Hop Frog endeavored, as usual, to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it, humbly, from the hand of the tyrant. Roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "See what a glass of good wine can do. Why, your eyes are shining already." Poor fellow! His large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked round upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And now to business," said the prime minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters. All of us." And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the 7. Hop Frog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly. Come, said the king impatiently. "Have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf, abstractedly, for he was quite bewildered with the wine. "Endeavoring?" cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you mean by that? I perceive you are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this." And he poured out another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. "Drink, I say," shouted the monster, "or by the fiends!" The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat, and falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments, in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him, and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up the best she could, and, not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low, but harsh, and protracted grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. "What? What? What are you making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf.
Okay, so at this point, the king has thought it would help Hop Frog to be more creative if he got drunk, but Hop Frog, because of the way his brain is and his deformities, he doesn't. Alcohol doesn't affect him the same way it affects other people. It makes him like crazy mad, and so the king thinks it's hilarious. Trippetta begs the king to stop. He doesn't, and then we hear this like growling noise that we can only assume is coming from Hop Frog.
The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looking fixedly, but quietly, into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, "I? How could it have been me?" "The sound appeared to come from without," observed one of the courtiers. "I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon the cage wires." "True," replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion. "But on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth." Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hop Frog entered at once, and with spirit, into the plans for the masquerade. "I cannot tell what was the association of idea," observed he, very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life. "But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades. But here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons, and—" "Here we are!" cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. "8 to a fraction. I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion?" "We call it," replied the cripple, "the 8-chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted." "We will enact it," remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids. "The beauty of the game," continued Hop Frog, "lies in the fright it occasions among the women." "Capital!" roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry. "I will equip you as orangutans," proceeded the dwarf. "Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and, of course, they will be as much terrified as astonished." "Oh, this is exquisite!" exclaimed the king. "Hop Frog, I will make a man of you." "The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped, en masse, from your keepers. Your majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among a crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable." "It must be," said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured.
Okay, so after the king pushes Trippetta down, Hop Frog gets angry and he growls, but he pretends he didn't. And so Hop Frog is drunk. The king is trying to get Hop Frog to tell him what to do. And so Hop Frog's like, there is this thing we used to do back in my homeland, but I need 8 people. And the king is dumb enough to be like, oh, there's 8 of us. And because they haven't really seen what orangutans are, which are large, like ape type things, they're like monkeys, giant hairy monkeys that are like the size of people. They just assume Hop Frog is telling the truth. Like, people there wouldn't really know what an orangutan looks like. They have kind of a vague idea by word of mouth. And so Hop Frog is saying that what he's going to do is dress them as 8 orangutans, chain them together with real chains, so it seems like they escaped whoever had them captured. And they're going to like go into the ball like this, like sounding like and pretending like they're actually like these giant monkey beasts.
The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stockinette shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, someone of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8, by ocular demonstration, that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flue. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First, it was passed about the waist of the king, and tied, then about another of the party, and also tied. Then about all successively in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the parties stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters, at right angles across the floor, after the fashion adopted at the present day by those who captured chimpanzees, or other large apes, in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending on a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual, but, in order not to look unsightly, this latter passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but, in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion it was that, on this occasion, the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which, in weather so warm, it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the saloon, could not all be expected to keep from out its center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the war, and a flambeau emitting sweet odor was placed in the hand of each of the caryatides that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether.
Okay, so here we get some description. We get 2 descriptions, one of the room and one of the king and his men. So they basically are tarred and feathered. It's actually tarred and flued, so it's not quite feathers. It's like this material. And so they're like covered head to toe in this like hairy, furry material. And then they take a chain and chain it around each person's waist, and then connect the next one and connect the next one, and they make a circle. And then the leftover chain goes from one side to the other, like the diameter of a circle, and then the rest of it crosses across the other way. So they basically are kind of stuck in a circular formation. And so they're not in the room yet, but that's like how they're sort of stuck together. So they can essentially, if they're in the middle of the room, they can terrify everyone all at once instead of all facing the same way. So now we get a description of what the hall is like. Remember, there's no electricity, so everything is lit by candle, and this party's at night. So there's a giant skylight, and normally there's like a chain coming down from the outside down, and there's like a chandelier with candles on it. But because it's a warm night and people are going to be in a super expensive costumes, and like they don't want the wax from the candles dripping onto people's costumes, so instead they took the chandelier out, and they have just like torches on all the walls going around the edges. And so that's kind of where we're at as far as like imagining in your head what it looks like and what the costumes look like.
The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in, all together, for the impediments of their chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee, as had been anticipated. There were not a few guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and, at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for, in fact, there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor.
Okay, so now what happens is Hop Frog tells the king, okay, here's the deal. People are going to be super freaked out, so you don't want to allow any weapons in the room or they'll probably kill you. So the king ordered that nobody in the room, no workers, no guests can have weapons. And he also said if you really want to scare people, because people are going to run, once you go in the room, you need to order all the doors to be locked and have them give me, Hop Frog, the keys so that otherwise people just unlock the doors and run out and the whole thing's over. And that's what he did. So he ordered no weapons to be in the room and then all the doors locked and Hop Frog had the only keys. So as these orangutans, which is really the king and his people in costume, are like tripping on themselves and running around and making noises and scaring people, people are freaked out and they're like trying not to run over each other. And slowly, nobody notices, but slowly out of the skylight, a chain with a hook that used to have the chandelier on it comes down and is just like waist high off the floor. So let's continue.
Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and, of course, in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and, in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and, as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection, and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered, in some measure, from their alarm, and, beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me!" now screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din. "Leave them to me! I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when, seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatides, he returned, as he went, to the center of the room, leaping, with the agility of a monkey, upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are." And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hop Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down toward them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were.
Okay, so now They don't notice the chain, and what happens is the chain hooks into the middle where those two chains are crossed. So the hook chains in, and all of a sudden it goes up just like 3 feet, enough so that the men's feet still touch the ground, but they're all like kind of squished together because the chain has pulled them in. And people are starting to laugh, and now they're starting to laugh, and everyone realizes it's a big joke. And Hot Frog's like, you know what? I'll figure out who they are. And he like climbs over people, grabs a torch off the wall because he needs light, and he actually climbs up the orangutans, grabs onto the chain, and remember his upper body is like super mega strong, so that's nothing to him. He can climb like you wouldn't believe. And so he's about, maybe 3 feet out of their reach above them on the chain, and he's got the flame down by them, lighting up their faces so that people can see who they are. He's like, I'll see who they are. And then there's a whistle. And all of a sudden the chain flies like 30 feet in the air, like 3 stories. It's crazy. And now they're dangling. All those people are dangling in the air. And they're starting to like not be quite as happy about it. So let's finish and see what happens.
So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at this ascent that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But, on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth and glared, with an expression of maniacal rage, into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha!" said at length the infuriated jester. "Aha! I begin to see who these people are now." Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely, amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken, and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and, as he made this movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity, and once more spoke. "I now see distinctly," he said, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors. A king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop Frog, the jester, and this is my last jest." Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that, together, they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.
That is the end. So, what happened? Let's go over that really quick. So basically, everyone starts freaking out, and then they hear this like growling, and it's Hop Frog. He is angry. So he says, "Oh, like, let me see who these people are." And he lights them on fire because the tar and the flue that they're wearing is super flammable. And he says, look it. We see who it is. It is this king who, like, hits young girls and his 7 homies who encourage him to be a terrible person. I am just Hop Frog, the Joker, and this is my last joke. And he throws his torch on them, and the king and his men are basically a human chandelier, and they burn to death, and they die hanging above everyone, and everyone is just in shock. Because if you remember, Hop Frog had convinced the king not to allow anyone to have weapons, therefore no one could go after Hop Frog. Frog is super mega strong, so he just climbed up the chain and out the skylight. And Hop Frog insisted that the doors be locked and no one can get out, and Hop Frog has the only keys. So everyone's stuck in the room with the 8 dead people hanging above them on fire. So, like I said, this is like if Poe were alive today, he would probably be writing the Saw movies franchise. This is one of his more tame stories, but they also think that Trippetta was the one who was outside pulling the human chandelier up too. So your mission now is to click on the independent practice. You are then going to write your first or I should say your own, you're going to write just the claim, but you're going to write 2 of them, kind of like what I did yesterday. So you're going to write your first practice for this unit. So how does Poe present the character of Hop Frog? So you're going to write 2 separate claims. So remember, you can't just repeat something in different words here. It has to be actual, you have to take that and think, okay, what can I infer? What can I logically assume based on this? So thinking of this section, I want you to come up with 2 different claims about Hop Frog. When you're done with that, you will submit and then start the next teaching lesson. So I will check back in with you later.